is. I think we are now recording according to my blurb here. Okay, good, cool. So what we're doing here with this first chapter after the designation of historic districts is looking at, oops, this is the wrong one. Looking at a follow-up to that. This is the next chapter, sorry. Which essentially is looking at these historic districts and ordinances and talking a little bit about how it kind of fits that whole idea. Now, it's become, historic districts have become very popular, especially since Charleston, first established it. Although it did take Charleston a while longer to work out the kinks, and we're still working them out. And this points to the issues of these historic districts and just how it's not a static thing, and it's stuff that's still being worked on all the time. So what we're looking at here by way of a review of the sort of legal basis of these historic districts is that it's based on the idea of aesthetics plus, essentially that properties could be controlled for aesthetic reasons, and that it must be, part of the rationale of public health, safety, and welfare that we use to discuss livability and what makes for a place that helps to define the welfare of the public in a general way. It also got teeth in the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 that set up the mechanisms for establishing these historic districts in a more formal kind of way. These historic districts have proven to be very, shall we say, interesting. They're not static, just like the places they are trying to document are not static. We find various reasons for establishing a historic district. A lot of times people assume that whenever you have a historic district, it offers protection from the government, whatever agency that is, whether it's city or federal, and that's just simply not the case. What you have to do with a historic district is try to use it as a promotion tool, as a community building tool, as an economic development tool, so everybody is read in on the value of that district. It is all about preserving the historic properties, not just the properties though, but also the sort of land settlement pattern as much as you can, so that we hold on to what we can of the history. It's supposed to control new development. It's not supposed to say no to new development, but just to try to do it in a way that doesn't destroy what was there before. Of course, right after the war, there was a lot of that going on as cities were being emptied of their populations and urban renewal was tearing down whole sections of city. This was a way to try to say, look, we need to hang on to some of our history here. It provides incentives. Like I say, this is trying to do this through what's positive and not just as an enforcement action of the government. So trying to create something positive, these incentives for development like the tax rebates and that sort of thing. And also establishing a track record, which I think is pretty clear here in the downtown area of Charleston, that it actually helps with property values. In fact, maybe too much. In theory, it's supposed to help stabilize. In the case of Charleston, it's gotten beyond that point. But certainly in other areas where you're faced with declining urban areas, and it helps to stabilize it and put it back. In fact, it's been so useful, it's been so successful that a lot of places have had to reconsider their historic district ordinances in light of trying to maintain affordability and so forth, like the city of Charleston. But the whole thing is dependent on public relations, PR. And so this is, why we establish a historic district, to build community and also to build a more stable future. Let's see, control it. We try to control new development and we try to incentivize redevelopment more. And we can see that here. The idea is that we allow for new construction, but we try to maintain the integrity of the older stuff and try to see, how that might work. This is something that's not a static thing. A lot of times, historic districts will actually try to establish a guideline. In fact, that's a recommended process, but you find that in the city of Charleston, we've refused to do that because we don't want to be held into this sort of static idea of history, presumably. But how well that's worked out, that's something that has to be thought about from one generation to the next. But certainly it has helped with redevelopment incentives. You know, what we're looking at is people like to move into areas that has an established track record in the real estate market, and we certainly find that in Charleston, and certainly an area that's stable enough and not subject to decline. It helps to establish property values, and it helps to make people mindful of the places they live and their history. And this is brings up the point really here that there are a couple of issues related to the district that have been talked about and been subject of a lot of controversy, and that is the tendency for historic districts to freeze history, freeze time. And history keeps going on. You know, we're still making history. I mean, right now we're making big time history. What's going to happen as a result of this, we don't know. And how it's going to affect things, we don't know, but it's part of our history and something that obviously we're going to want to maintain some kind of cultural memory of, right? This is like the whole same thing here. There's an idea somehow that the historic districts tend to freeze history, and what we're really trying to do is trying to keep the change that occurs through redevelopment from completely swamping the history. And that's a delicate balance. That's a fine line to walk. And so what we try to do is maintain all the layers of a community's history. And it doesn't take long for you to look back in time to see just how, you know, modeled, if you will, the history has been. We look at places like Georgetown. It certainly was an area that was first a port. And you can see a lot of that with the factors buildings and so forth along the edge. And then later on, railroads came through there and it became a big shipping place, sort of a carry on to the port. And then what we have later on is this being developed as a residential area, and that's pretty much considered now just a very exclusive residential area. High walkability and also high price tag. Seton Hill, Baltimore is a little bit more layered. It was known as the French Quarter of Baltimore. That was one of its sort of initial, that was its initial sort of identity. Later on in 1791, St. Mary's became the first university in Maryland, was established there and was known as that area as the district for that seminary. It was pretty much run down in the 1920s as a result of a lot of the social activity going on there. The Prohibition Act, this area became a red light district. A lot of areas in the city of Charleston that are also considered red light districts at the time, and became, you know, noteworthy as maybe not the most desirable place in the world. And of course, afterwards, the place became slums, and it took sort of a new sort of reemergence of the interest in this area for its history and its proximity to Washington to make it the place it is today, which is now a very exclusive kind of place. Interesting. These layers cannot always be, how shall I say, socially commendable, but that is part of it. I had a friend of mine who bought a house in Baltimore right close to this, and she was faced with trying to figure out how much of it to preserve, which included a lot of very interesting murals and whatnot that she didn't want to live with, but was part of the history of this place. And so, you know, what we have here is trying to consider history in all of its many forms, right? The city of Charleston had red light districts, and we completely ignore that, of course, but, you know, when you look at the Market Hall, for example, on Market Street, that was very strong red light district, even as late as the 1970s and into the 80s. These areas were known for something less than, you know, desirable attributes, let's put it that way. Anyway, so what we have here is the idea of preserving the layers of history and presumably into the future, how that might work. You set up a district commission, which basically is trying to develop a group of people who monitor new projects and to comment on maintenance. In the city of Charleston, there's a requirement that a couple of them be real estate agents, a couple of them be architects, a couple of them be like neighborhood presidents or people from the neighborhoods. And then there's a city staff person which sort of rides herd over them all and keeps them organized and focused. And of course, city staff is developed a lot in trying to make recommendations to it. So the Historic Commission is supposed to basically take care of the heritage of this area, and it is, you know, it's a fluid kind of thing. We've seen a lot of changes within our own Historic District Commission over time, over the last couple of generations, and even within the last few years, as it's become sort of subservient again to zoning as a result of the Sergeant Jasper development. So what this commission does is try to monitor the situation, and they're in charge really of the whole process. It is dependent on state enabling legislation, of course, as well as the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. But you can see the purposes are really something to do with the health, safety, and welfare of the place, including its economic value and its beauty, this idea of aesthetics plus, again, creeping into it. The district itself is an interesting one. It's kind of difficult sometimes to establish the boundaries for a historic district. And what people do is say, okay, well, we have a history, we want to preserve it. We have a culture, we want to preserve it. And then we have to figure out how we go about doing that legitimately. And that's all written down now within the National Historic Preservation Act of '66 and now codified through the local states. And we see they provide certain ways for you to establish historic districts and essentially figure out how you inventory it, how you figure out what's historic and what isn't, what contributes and what doesn't, and then also provides a means for acquisition of certain properties for these purposes. And then also look at what's historic and what's not historic and how they might contribute to an overall idea of livability of the community. Again, community creeping into the discussion. Generally, it's supposed to represent history, but there are going to be elements within that that represent more modern history, and that's part of the idea of this continuity over time. In order for it to really be a historic district and not just a great place to live, it has to have these elements of history, at least 50 years old or more. They have commissions, people monitor it, they establish certain procedures for new projects to be examined, and then also an enforcement mechanism in case people do not follow the law. A lot of times, though, they try to make it incentivized, like I say, with tax breaks and so forth, and not just a function of legal regulation. One of the key elements of here is establishing historic district boundaries. This seems like a minor thing, but, you know, for example, in the city of Charleston, at one point, they established the crosstown as a boundary for the historic district, and the consequence of that is that on one side, along the street, in the middle of the street, so as a consequence of that, on one side of the street were a lot of dilapidated structures where people were letting them run down because they didn't think their little Charleston single house was the maximum use of the property, because on the other side of the street were Church's Fried Chicken, gas stations, other sort of modern amenities which would have gotten the individual property owners a whole lot more money when they sold than just being, you know, sold as a single house. And so it tended to not only create this unsettling juxtaposition of land uses, but also to gentrify or to cause problems with the historic area just on the other side of the street. So now we tend to prefer doing historic boundaries in the middle of blocks, for example, rather than down the middle of streets. But trying to establish that historic district done along natural sort of ways that make sense with the architecture and the layout of the topography, but also considering, you know, the unintended consequences of establishing that line. And so establishing the historic district boundaries is a big deal and part of the setup of the place. A lot of times these places will include various kinds of sub-districts. In the city of Charleston, you have the French Quarter, you have Ansonboro, you have other areas that reflect a particular time in history. And so what we have is this sort of mesh of neighborhoods within one historic district in Charleston. In other places, they might have it set up as separate districts depending on their tradition and history. But I think you can see that having a unified historic district is going to be a lot easier to deal with from the standpoint of the bureaucracy and the governance of these things and enforcement of laws. Again, this is another sort of more fully developed statement of why we established and how we established boundaries in order to try to, you know, set apart an area from another. And then the whole thing has to be approved through the State Historic Preservation Office, also known as the SHPO. You'll hear this term used a good deal. And so they look at it from a sort of a statewide level before it can be approved. And like I say, this is all done through the aegis of state laws anyway. And there are a lot of concerns about historic districts. People worry about property values not being the same. They worry about additional work required for the governance of these things. The BAR certainly takes about a fair amount of time on several levels for the city. There are many times institutions like the College of Charleston doesn't always favor historic districts. Looking at our own past at the college, it wasn't until the last decade or so that the college made a decision to go ahead and comply with BAR regulations. They refused to do that up to that point because they were state property. But the fallout in terms of public relations was so bad that they eventually came around. And so also people worry about historic preservation or preservation as a way to affect their property values. That's a hard sell, because obviously in some cases you are taking a hit on your property values when you become part of the district and you can't do everything you want to with the property. But what happens, especially over a longer period of time, is that the whole district takes on a heck of a lot more value than if it were broken apart piecemeal. And so this is the tricky part to try to convince people of going into the process, is how we're looking for the benefit of the whole and not just the individual property owners, because that's kind of the way we roll here, especially in the free market system in this country. One interesting perspective too relating to this idea of history as static is that the text asks the question of, if Oak Park had a historic district ordinance, then Frank Lloyd Wright probably would never have had his house approved to be put in there because it was radically different. And that's a valid point. How do we keep history from being sort of frozen when we get into these places? Certainly you can look back in our own city and see, like the Satilli House and the College of Charleston campus there right in the middle, involved demolishing about 4 historic structures. That would have been an early teardown. Would that be approved today? Probably not. But yet we all now see the Satilli House as kind of this iconic building on campus. And so these are, legitimate questions. And perhaps this is one reason why the city of Charleston has not taken on guidelines per se. It's seeing them guidelines to building, seeing them as being stultifying to new design, and try to interpret each design on its own. Tricky business. Trying to keep history from being sort of frozen in these circumstances. There are certain requirements for running a meeting. Like I say, it needs to be a fair public process and have certain processes in terms of advertising and formal application and being on agendas and, having the meetings conducted fairly where everybody has a chance to speak is all part of the process to try to keep the thing legal, for that matter. One of the other, as we talked about before, when you're setting it up, other activities is to continue the idea of surveying properties. We've had maybe a half a dozen extensions to the historic district in the city of Charleston since its original founding in 1931. And you can see that it's required by sort of encroaching modernity and threats and sort of a realization that certain areas are now historic. They really only have to be 50 years old to really be historic. And so they required to constantly kind of update their inventories. Within these areas, there's also requirements for maintenance and consolidating the area and coordinating it with zoning. We also try to make sure that the area is advertised and that people realize the value of it. So public relations is a big part of it. And then there's this idea of eminent domain. And I'm not sure how many of you ever heard of this, but this is the power of local governance or state governance to take over somebody's property, to buy somebody's property out, giving them fair value for it, exercising the police power of the state for the public health, safety, and welfare. Now, theoretically, these areas, these houses that might get bought might be used for, a fire station or a police station and so forth. There's obviously a lot of pushback from that from these individual property owners. And so this is done very selectively and only when required in theory. And that's kind of the basis, sort of the bottom line. If you really need to acquire property for the public benefit and are able to pay full market value for it, then this idea of eminent domain is out there as another resort. The ordinances, as it says here, have to reflect the public health, safety, and welfare. They need to be reasonable and they should be fair, meaning that everybody has to have a voice and that we're not really taking people's property without just compensation. That's the basis for a lot of this, and you can see this reflected in the sort of legal basis of preservation. When we look at the historic district ordinances, we see that there's this criteria for trying to develop it, which tries to create an ordinance that is clear, that we know what's going to happen with it, that it's part of the state sort of enabling legislation, that people feel the need for it. It's a community need and people will back it up. And that we can have certain criteria that are established. Now, certainly within the city of Charleston, these criteria are a little bit more open than in other places, but that's the idea. We basically try to define the areas, what the criteria is, and then create the sort of meeting requirements and review requirements that represent our due process in this whole effort. So I'm going to stop talking since I've been talking for 25 minutes, and that theoretically is the limit to what I should be doing at one point, and just see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop the share at this point and go back to pictures. We've got a fair number of people here. Any of that make any sense to you guys? Hello. Let me try. Adeline, are you there? Hi. So what was your sense of all of that? Could you see the value of the historic district? Do you see that the historic district has a future in the city of Charleston, or do you think it's an outdated idea?
Yeah, I thought it does, or I think that it does, just because I think at this point we've been trying to preserve it for so long that I think that continuing it would be a good idea. I mean, obviously it comes with challenges, but I think so.
You can see how it's affected for the better a lot of the property values, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So to what extent do you think that it's also a problem with property values? I'll jump over to somebody else. How about Lucy? Are you there, Lucy Berry?
A lot of problems.
I'm just jumping around here. Sorry, Adeline.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
Anybody else want to speak up? What do you see as being the future of the historic district ordinance going forward? John, you there? John Van Dyke? Hello. Catherine Rakes, are you there? Hannah, are you there? Hello. Well, I think there is a future to it, but what we're finding is that it continues to have to evolve. Within the last few years, we've had to reconsider building heights and see the BAR as being secondary to the zoning legislation in order to keep from running foul of private property interests, especially now that there's so much pressure on them. But the real question is, are we killing the goose that laid the golden egg, or are we building a more resilient, more profitable local community? This is an open question. And a lot of it is subject to our own sort of desire to become part of that process, to engage that debate. And so the city that we build, the city that the future generations will have is the city that we are building right now. And so this is the requirement for ourselves as we think about the ordinance and the district and how we want to evolve over time. From John, the sound is so loud you wouldn't be able to hear me. Okay, John, sorry about that. My sound is too loud. I'll turn it down. I didn't realize it was too loud.
I think he means his like background noise, like his roommates are probably making noise or something.
Yeah, the only thing I have here is a little fan blowing on me, so I don't, well, maybe it's coming from somewhere, I don't know. Somebody has an open mic sometimes. I'm not hearing anything on this end. So anyway, we've gone through the revisions to the grading. We've gone through the idea of the paper and how we might want to think about that. And then I've gone through another chapter. I'll sit down and record another chapter here and go ahead and post them online, and also see what I can do about getting last week's presentation put back online. We have limited time, so I need to keep going each class with another chapter, and I'll try to make them available as much as technology can online. And we're looking towards a final during the week of finals, and it'll be a take home.
And
Anybody have any questions? Sorry?
For the neighborhood paper, I know we were supposed to do it as a group, and now that we're kind of doing it on our own, are we still doing 7 to 8 pages, or?
Well, as I said at the very beginning, what we'll do is have that
Okay.
in a rough way. I mean,
Okay. Okay.
7 or 8 pages is really not that much.
Yeah.
But, I don't expect it to be quite so well researched, but hopefully it'll be more interesting for you because you're doing your own neighborhood.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Where are you, Gabe? Where are you hanging out?
I'm at the Peninsula, Ellis Plantation, Ellis Creek, James Island.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that would be a worthwhile area to talk about.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm going to go back and pause my recording at this point, and I'm going to say goodbye to the recording and answer other questions as we go forward. Okay, here we go. Stopping.